All right, guys, here we are. Here we are at 6.6, social changes during the 20th century. Here's a quick summary for you. The 20th century World War produced two basic responses. The first, a feeling of skepticism concerning the future. And the second, the desire to possess the many new products on the market after both wars in an attempt to secure a comfortable future for their citizens. Western and Japanese governments established social welfare systems, particularly for the aging. Women's rights increased at the same time the traditional female roles persisted. A new global culture saw the dominance of Western influence. Okay, society after World War I. All right, during the 20s, Western society, most notably the U.S., saw a rise in mass consumerism. That's why we call it the Roaring Twenties, especially in household appliances and automobiles. The automobile decreased isolation and also allowed new freedoms for some adolescents like you in the United States. Some women turned to fashions that called for shorter skirts, and hairstyles and behavior that allowed freer self-expression. The movie industry was not only an outlet for artistic expression, but also a new source of good family entertainment. Modern painters such as Pablo Picasso combined geometric figures with non-Western art styles, particularly African, to create a new style called, anybody know the name of his style? Cubism. Modern architecture featured the use of concrete and broad expanse of glass. At the same time, post-war Western society was characterized by a general feeling of skepticism. The devastation brought by the century's first global depression was heightened by the despair of the Great Depression. Working classes and middle classes faced the prospect of unemployment or reduced salaries. In Japan, the Depression increased suspicions of the Western way of life. Western states began to provide old age and medical insurance that eventually led to the institution of the welfare state. In the United States, the New Deal took government spending to new heights under FDR in an attempt to resolve the economic stagnation of the Depression and provide for social programs. Western European governments began to provide assistance to families with several children. All right, our next topic is going to be after World War II. So after World War II, more women entered the workforce. Divorce made more accessible and effective birth control more conveniently available with the introduction of the birth control pill. Many European countries provided daycare centers for working mothers. In the United States, the National Organization for Women, known as NOW, founded in 1966, campaigned for women's rights. The role of the church in family life decreased as church attendance fell, especially in Europe. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. experienced a civil rights movement, that ended segregation of African Americans and increased voting rights. Student protests against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War swept college campuses in the 60s and the early 70s. In the 1970s and 80s, some Westerners began to question the concept of the welfare state. Both Great Britain and the United States elected leaders who adopted a more conservative approach toward government spending. Welfare programs were decreased under the leadership of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. All All right. And U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Western European economic growth soared during the 1980s, producing a marked increase in consumer goods. Educational opportunities broadened throughout the world. All right, let's look at society in the Soviet Union. So Soviet leaders also built a system of welfare services, including protection for the sick and the aged. Soviet schools taught that religion was a myth. Western styles of art were denounced as decadent. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union and most Eastern European nations were industrialized. Unlike the Western world, the factories in the communist bloc favored the production of heavy goods and consumer goods. As industrialism spread through Eastern Europe, more families engaged in sport activities and movie and television viewing. By the 1960s, cultural exchanges with the West gave the Soviet citizens some contact with Western media and ways of life. An emphasis on sports programs made Soviet athletes intense competitors in the Olympic Games. Okay, now let's look at Japan. In the 1920s, Japan also experienced a rise in mass consumerism. The film industry became popular, and secondary education reached greater numbers of students. After World War II, the new U.S.-influenced government in Japan provided for women suffrage and abolished Shintoism as the state religion. The Japanese preserved their traditional respect for their elders. All right, by creating a social security system for the elderly. After the end of the U.S. occupation, the Japanese government began asserting more control over their lives of the citizens, including controlling the content of student textbooks. Traditions such as the tea ceremony and kabuki and no theater continued. Japanese work schedules allowed for less leisure time than in the Western societies. One leisure activity became extremely popular, though, which was baseball. Introduced to Japan during the U.S. occupation. Women continued to occupy traditional homemaking and child-rearing roles. All right, let's look at China now. China has May 4th movement. 1919 honored the role that women had played in the Chinese Revolution by increasing women's rights. Foot binding was outlawed, and women were given wider educational and career opportunities. Although the Kuomintang attempted to return Chinese women to their more traditional roles, Chinese communists gave them a number of roles in their revolution. Women were allowed to bear arms and the military. Since the institution of Mao's government in 1949, Chinese women have been expected to work outside the home while maintaining their traditional responsibilities in the home as well. Okay, let's look at Latin America now. After the Mexican Revolution, Mexican artists such as Diego Rivera painted murals on public buildings. The murals depicting scenes from the revolutions and hopes for a social progress in the future. Latin American folk culture includes strong elements of native Indian and African cultures. Although the region remained largely Roman Catholic, the latter decades of the 20th century and the beginnings of the 20th century saw significant increases in the popularity of evangelical Protestant denominations throughout Latin America. Also popular in Latin America, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, is liberation theology, a belief that emphasizes social justice for victims of poverty and oppression. Throughout the 20th century, Latin American women tended to retain their traditional roles. Women were not allowed to vote until 1929, when Ecuador became the first Latin American nation to allow women's suffrage. By the latter part of the 20th century, Latin American women controlled small businesses and were sometimes active in politics, including membership in the legislature. All right, now let's look at Africa. Women's suffrage was written into the constitutions of new nations. The participation of women in African independence movements was rewarded, resulting in some opportunities for women to hold political office. Many of the new nations also granted women increased opportunities for education and employment. Early marriage, however, often continued to confine women to traditional roles. Government imposition of Sharia law, Muslim law, in regions of Nigeria and other Muslims-dominated African nations threatened not only the independence but also the security of women in Africa. All right, lastly, we'll look at what the global culture that is developing. In today's world, the global culture has been dominated by new trends and styles, a situation that has especially produced disapproval in East Asian and Islamic cultures. English is the language of commerce and of the internet. The Western appreciation for science has been a hallmark of the global age. Sometimes reactions to globalization created changes in religious beliefs and practices. Beginning in the 1960s, new age religions dependent upon astrology emerged. Fundamentalism, or the return to traditional beliefs and practices, became the goal of many practitioners of major religions, especially Christianity and Islam. The new global culture places more emphasis on monetary wealth, education, and professional position rather than on land ownership or inherited position. At the same time, traditions continued. In India, for example, remnants of the caste system caused some Indians to cling to caste restrictions that kept even though they had been outlawed. Laws of almost all nations allowed women's suffrage. The global culture continued to display regional traditions and characteristics, while national pride surfaced in international athletic competitions such as the Olympic Games and the World Cup, soccer, or FIFA. All right, and in summary, in the interim time between the World Wars and after World War II, labor-saving devices transformed leisure time in Europe and the United States. Movies and television provided family entertainment. Whereas the automobile created a new lifestyle for Western teenagers. Governments instituted welfare programs, and women's political rights were broadened worldwide. Religion declined in popularity, especially in Europe, and the Soviet Union denounced the importance of religion. Although women's rights were expanded, women were expected to continue to carry out traditional roles. The new global culture emphasized the importance of professional status and knowledge over family social position. The dominance of Western culture and the English language met with disapproval in some Eastern and Islamic cultures. All right, guys, good job.